Welcome back. Turning now to the investigations of the Trump administration. In our NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, we asked people whether they support Democrats providing more oversight by opening up new investigations of President Trump and his administration. Overall, 55% said yes, while 42% said no. Take a look at the party breakdown. It won't surprise you. It was by a margin of 88 to 10 that Democrats said yes. They support more investigations. Among Republicans, the result was essentially flipped. Only 18% said yes, while 81% are opposed. For what it's worth, independents looked like the mix of the two, with a majority wanting more investigations. Joining me now is the man who will lead the House Intelligence Committee in the next Congress. It's Democrat Adam Schiff of California. Welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Thank you.
Let me start with an interview you gave to The New Yorker. The headline over it was Adam Schiff's plans to obliterate Trump's red line. Now, the reference was to the president had famously said, if they go into my businesses, if Mueller at the time goes into my personal businesses before the campaign, that would be a red line. That's too much. The implication being maybe he'd fire him or something else. What does that headline mean in practice, that you're going to obliterate the red line?
Well, obliterate was not my choice of words.
Fair enough.
But what it means is this. What ought to concern us the most from an oversight point of view is there any entanglement with a foreign power that might influence U.S. policy against our national interest? And what we saw in the Michael Cohen revelations, some of the Michael Cohen revelations, that the president, while he was denying any dealings with Russia, his business actually was pursuing a multi-million-dollar deal in Moscow, hiding it from the country, seeking the Kremlin's help with it. That's deeply compromising. Now, the president has wanted to draw a red line and say, you can't look at my business. But if the president's business is trying to curry favor with the Kremlin, we can't ignore that. And the president should not be in a position to say, you can't investigate certain things, only other things that I don't care as much about. So that's what I mean. If Mueller is not looking into this, and I don't know whether he is, someone needs to, because otherwise we're being derelict with our security.
What U.S. policies do you believe have already been influenced by that you fear might have been influenced by financial dealings with the president?
Well, unquestionably, the U.S. response to the Russian hacking of our election has been influenced by something. Whether it's been influenced by the president being concerned that his effort to build the Trump Tower deal would come out, because, of course, the Russians knew about it. They were on the other end of that transaction. Dmitry Peskov was involved in the cover-up of that. Whether that was the motivation, or whether there's other motivation, or whether it's simply Donald Trump reacting to the question that's been raised about his legitimacy because of the taint over the election, I don't know, but we need to find out.
Is Saudi Arabia fit into that in your mind? And is that something you plan on investigating as well?
Well, Saudi Arabia certainly could fit into it. If the Saudis were funneling money into the inauguration committee, or the Saudi investment in the Trump businesses, buying hotel rooms, the deals that Trump talked about during the campaign that made him love the Saudis so much, if that's warping U.S. policy, if it's affecting the president's unwillingness to criticize the Crown Prince over the murder of Khashoggi, then we need to know about it. Now, some of this may be the purview of our committee. Some of it will be the purview of other committees. We will be working amongst ourselves to make sure that we don't step on each other's toes, and that we work in a coordinated way.
What do you believe that Deutsche Bank financial records are going to show you? Because that's one of the things. This is a bank that the Trump organization did some work with. Why them? What will their records show?
Well, the concern about Deutsche Bank is that they have a history of laundering Russian money. They paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to the state of New York because they were laundering Russian money. And this apparently was the one bank that was willing to do business with the Trump organization. Now, is that a coincidence? What do we make of what the president's sons are reported have said about not needing to deal with U.S. banks because they got all the cash they needed from Russia, or a disproportionate share of their assets coming from Russia? If this is a form of compromise, it needs to be exposed.
You have, Gina Haspel, the director of the CIA, has now given a briefing, I believe, to House leaders, I believe the Intelligence Committee. I assume you have now been briefed on this. What you have now learned, we've heard, Bob Corker essentially said, if a jury heard what I heard, MBS, the Crown Prince there, would be convicted in 30 minutes. Is that a fair read of what you learned in your briefing?
I don't think there's any question that the Crown Prince was aware and knowing and would have had to approve an operation like this. And so what concerns me is when I hear people like the Secretary of State say things that may be literally true but are deeply misleading. Mm-hmm. These are important issues as they affect the policy of the United States. Policymakers like the House and Senate need to make decisions on the best intelligence, and I think you saw by that overwhelming unanimous vote in the Senate that senators are convinced, and rightly so, of the Crown Prince's role in this.
But should we intervene in Saudi politics and basically push the king to dump the Crown Prince?
What we ought to do, and here's where we really need to rely on our intelligence agencies, is we need to go through a menu of what are the responses here. Everything from using Magnitsky Act sanctions against the Crown Prince to suspending arms sales to suspending any support of the war in Yemen. We need to get our intelligence agencies' best estimate. What will the Saudi reaction be? Right. If the Crown Prince were to fall, who comes next? What does that mean in terms of our interest in the region?
You're in a little bit of a go slow approach.
Well, my feeling is you use the best intelligence. You don't ignore it. You don't discount it. You don't publicly disavow it. You use it to guide your decision making. And there is still a need to have a relationship with the kingdom. It ought to be governed, though, by the facts.
A couple things. The last time you were here, you talked about you were looking at other transcripts of people that gave interviews to the House Intelligence Committee to basically see if you were lied to. Have you found some instances that you think are questionable, and have you referred it to Mr. Mueller?
We have found testimony that we find deeply concerning, and certainly would include Mr. Stone among that group. It is my hope
Roger
that
Stone is
yes,
among you believe lied to Congress.
I believe that there's ample reason to be concerned about his truthfulness, and I do think that with respect to Mr. Stone and perhaps others, the special counsel is in a better position to determine the truth or falsity of that testimony, and that we ought to provide it to special counsel.
Do you have a theory as to why Michael Flynn's lawyers are attacking the FBI?
I do.
What's your theory?
Well, there are several witnesses now who are trying to have it both ways in some degree. You've got Manafort, who was clearly double dealing, trying to get a cooperation agreement.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.